point, quite rightly, that what has been announced in terms of the imposition of universal tariffs is a major blow to the world economy. It creates a deepened level of uncertainty, and where you have uncertainty, you only have losers. When it comes to the impact on businesses, on workers and indeed on consumers, there are very real issues that arise from the unilateral imposition of tariffs in this way. Ultimately, tariffs result in higher prices for consumers, less trade being done between jurisdictions, and it can lead to the viability of companies coming under threat. And so that is why the response from the European Union will be very carefully calibrated over the period ahead. Our first message is that we are ready to negotiate. There has been engagement between Commissioner Šefčovič, Secretary Lutnick and others over the last number of weeks, and we are now ready to step up those negotiations over the days ahead. The second message is that we will continue to diversify our trade relationships. The EU is a powerhouse in international trade, and more countries around the world are engaging now proactively with the European Union with a view to entering into trading agreements, because they see the EU as a very safe, trusted and reliable partner that honours its international commitments when it comes to trade. We also need to strengthen the single market, and we must address the competitiveness challenges that have emerged in recent years, and much of that is within our own gift and within our own control, closing the productivity gap that has arisen between the EU and the US and China, for example, and we have pointers as to what we need to do in the Draghi report, the Letter report, and we have already in the first 4 months in office introduced a range of different packages that will make a tangible difference to the competitiveness of the European economy. In relation to the possible impact of the measures announced by President Trump last night, the current provisional estimate is that overall around €380 billion of EU exports will be subject to the additional tariffs. That comprises of approximately €290 billion subject to the so-called reciprocal tariffs, €26 billion subject to US Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminium, and €67 billion subject to US Section 232 tariffs on cars and car parts. This would represent overall around 70% of all EU exports to the US being subject to new tariffs that have been announced yesterday and indeed in recent days, which would result in around €80 billion in additional duties on EU exports to the United States. This relationship between the US and the EU is mutually beneficial. We are each other's most important trade and investment partner. Annual trade stands at around €1.6 trillion per annum. So we need to work together to address the global issues that are there in respect of barriers to entry to certain markets, in relation to overcapacity, in relation to subsidies. But the EU is not the problem. The EU is part of the solution, because this mutually beneficial relationship has resulted in millions of jobs being created on both sides of the Atlantic over many, many decades. And we want that good cooperation, that strong relationship, mutually respectful and beneficial to continue. And the final point I want to underline is the importance of unity at an EU level, because acting as a bloc, the fact that trade is a competence of the European Commission in full consultation and agreement, of course, with the Member States, gives us a collective strength that we would not have individually. And our greatest prize is access to the EU single market of 450 million people, the largest and the most important single market in the world. So we are entering into this period of uncertainty and turbulence as an EU from a position of strength. We stand ready to negotiate, but we also stand ready to respond and to defend the interests of European businesses and our member states in the event that negotiations fail. That is not a scenario that we want to be in, but we will act if required, but our first preference is that we would have negotiations, and we are now ready to enter into meaningful negotiations without delay. Thank you very much.
We're listening here to the Irish Prime Minister meeting earlier today with the EU Commissioner on the second day, as we just saw President Donald Trump issuing some sweeping tariffs to several countries across the world. Thank you all for joining us here at Live Now from Fox on this Thursday morning, April 3rd. My name is Corral Lahara, and I'll be with you throughout the next couple of hours, continuing to guide you through the day's top stories, showcasing live looks from around the world. We're stepping away for a brief commercial break. A live look before we do that out in Dublin. This is the port of Dublin over in Ireland, again, as President Trump has just launched a new barrage of tariffs.
Es oficial. Los mejores carros económicos están en Honda. Carros, SUVs y vans Honda. Maneja lo mejor desde $259 al mes. O ahorra miles con el 0% de interés por 72 meses. El Honda Accord, Civic, Passport y Odyssey 2025 han sido nombrados los mejores carros económicos por US News y World Report. Desde tan solo $259 al mes o el 0%. Busca hoy tu concesionario Honda local.
You've had taste made in the palm of your hand. Now we're in your home, where the struggle becomes your victory.
Where style meets flavor. Wherever you need to be.
Where we bring the smoke and the fire.
Taste Made is streaming in all the places good taste matters.
It's pretty frickin' delicious.
Where we always pay the exceptional, the unexpected.
Where the reward is sweeter.
Now we're everywhere you need to be. Taste Made.
Welcome back into Live Now from Fox. We are taking a live look out there in Brussels, Belgium, as Secretary of State Marco Rubio was just in this camera angle. We have seen several of these world leaders convening for yet another NATO summit. Let's see if this camera stabilizes a little bit more. We get a better picture on who is inside this meeting. But they did take their group photo, as is customary with many of these conventions that they host, and it comes as the Trump administration's new envoy to NATO, as well as the Secretary of State, are seeking to reassure NATO allies that the U.S. commitment to their alliance remains strong. The Secretary on Thursday decried, quote, hysteria and hyperbole in the media about President Trump's intentions, despite persistent signals from Washington that NATO, as it has existed for 75 years, may no longer be relevant. Secretary Rubio and newly confirmed U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Matt Whitaker, are in Brussels for that meeting of alliance foreign ministers, in which many are hoping Rubio will shed light on the year's security plans in Europe. In a statement, that new envoy, Whitaker, said that, quote, under President Trump's leadership, NATO will be stronger and more effective than ever before. And I believe that a robust NATO can continue to serve as a bedrock of peace and prosperity. I don't really think that at this moment we're going to get a clear look of Rubio, but we do see there on your screen a State Department spokesperson, Tammy Bruce, also convening with several of these NATO leaders in Brussels as they are walking into that meeting room. Later on today, we are expecting some joint remarks between our Secretary of State as well as the Danish Foreign Minister, so we have our eye on that and we'll bring it to you as soon as it gets underway. At the same time, let's continue on with the sweeping top story of this week, which of course are those tariffs that President Trump has now enacted against several countries across the world. Sweeping tariffs of about 25% to several of our U.S. allies. Just before the commercial break, we were listening into some comments from over in Dublin, Ireland earlier today, as the Prime Minister was answering some questions along with the EU Commissioner about what their country is doing given this news that was just brought yesterday from the President of the U.S. That was on April 2nd, something that he dubbed, quote, Liberation Day. Let's continue on with more of these comments from Ireland next.
Commissioner, would the EU make something like that available as it has done in the past when prices have hit?
I think it's somewhat early yet to be talking in terms of supports. I think this is not the end of the story. It's not too late for negotiations. I think there is some part of this yet to be determined. I understand that Commissioner Šefčovič will be engaging with the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, in the next number of days, if not tomorrow. My understanding is we had the announcement last evening. My view is that there will be a period of engagement. So we have to see where this settles. And every crisis is different. So the kind of supports that were in the previous crisis may not apply in this case. I think what we do have to do is, as I said, control the controllables in respect of investment in infrastructure, and at European level, working very hard to double down on the single market. There are still too many barriers within Europe. And I think Ireland has benefited enormously from a good single market. It can be even better. And we're working with others in terms of the Saving and Investment Union to release capital for investment, particularly for our entrepreneurs, small to medium-sized companies. So there's a lot we can do in the interim to improve our own competitiveness. We need to work with speed to enable us to do that. And also then through Enterprise Ireland, through the IDA, to continue to work with the multinational companies, with our own indigenous companies, and really accelerate diversification into different markets. The Commissioner has said, and the Commissioner has said, that potentially a trade deal with India will be closed by the end of the year, potentially, and Indonesia is another country. So a lot of markets out there that we can access and increase exports to.
So at this point in time, Joe, we're doing a comprehensive analysis of what has been announced so that we can evaluate the content, what the possible consequences are for member states and indeed for the EU as a whole. And I think it's important that we don't react impulsively. This is an extremely serious matter. Yes, we are finalising the first package of countermeasures in response to the tariffs that had been announced on steel, and we are preparing for further countermeasures to protect our interests and indeed our businesses if negotiations fail. And I think we have a collective responsibility to ensure that that if does not come to pass. And we will have the direct engagement again between Maroš Šefčovič and Howard Lutnick tomorrow. We want to see meaningful, substantive negotiations take place quickly because the EU will need to respond in the event that negotiations fail. We have been preparing for this scenario and many other alternative scenarios in respect of trade for many, many months. So the EU stands ready, but we want to avoid that scenario where tariffs are being introduced against each other, because we know what the consequences are for businesses, for consumers, for countries, for our respective economies and for workers, and that's not a road that any of us should want to go down. But at the same time, where we have to respond, we will respond firmly and proportionately, but in the first instance we should all have a collective effort to see if we can reach agreement in the days ahead.
Thank you. To ask you both, I know the Commissioner has a fairly decent knowledge of the Irish economy, but are we going to be able to survive a recession? Do we think that things are going to get really bad? I know the Commissioner was mentioning monetary values of what the tariffs might mean. Do we have an Ireland breakdown? Do we know how much this is going to cost us? And then secondly, Hungary has said that they're going to withdraw from the ICC. Can I get your reaction to that and the visit of the Israeli Prime Minister? And are you comfortable continuing to work with Viktor Orban at the Council?
Well, two things on that. In the first instance, your first question again, Louise, is on the recession. I think it's important that we take on board that this, I think, has some distance to go yet. And we don't yet have a clear settled pattern as to what the permanent situation will be. There is no doubt that the world has changed, and the old order, as I said in the Dáil yesterday, is gone, but the new order hasn't yet been precisely determined. In other words, I anticipate negotiations. I believe there will be negotiations. So I think we have to see how that plays out over the next while. The real problem is, though, the imposition of tariffs on such a wide scale and at a high level across the world will have a dampening effect on investment. And that in itself could create recessionary sort of trends across the world. So I'm worried more about the global impact of this and the impact on investments, the pausing of investments perhaps, and people, investors generally keeping the head below the parapet until this settles down. And that is a problem. Sentiment matters, psychology matters. The business people and investors want certainty, stability, predictability. They don't have that at the moment, and that's my overarching concern. We don't have, we don't have specific breakdowns yet, but we will obviously ascertain those. It'll impact every EU member state, and Ireland's economy is integrated fully within the European Union. I am concerned about trends within Hungary, and there are procedures there in terms of dealing with member states who we believe have either transgressed the rule of law or who are not really behaving in the full spirit of EU unity or indeed adherence to EU treaties. And there's a step-by-step approach there. I know Commissioner McGrath has responsibilities in the area of rule of law, and I'm very conscious of the citizens of Hungary, many of whom eagerly want to obviously remain within the European Union, want to be part of the European Union. I'm always very conscious of that in terms of my engagement with our EU member states. But it is a concern. We've fully supported the ICC. We've provided significant funding, additional funding, above any per capita contribution to the ICC. International rule of law is extremely important, and Ireland will continue to adhere to it.
Yeah, on the issue of trade, again, I would underline the value of the collective, and the Commission will act in the interests of the European economy and all of its member states, including Ireland. And of course, I have a deep knowledge of the Irish economy, of the structural nature of it, it being such an open trading economy for whom international trade has been the lifeblood, and that's because of good decisions made over successive governments for many years, and the talent in the country as well. And those strengths will continue to endure, and I think will stand to Ireland as we navigate our way through this period. And that's why the issue of unity of purpose and unity of approach by EU member states is going to be really important here. And the Commission has a central role, but there will of course be consultation with the member states, and ultimately the member states will have a direct say in respect of any trade defence measures that the Commission may formally propose for adoption. I also think it's worth underlining that, contrary to the narrative that was portrayed last night, the trade relationship between the EU and the US is broadly balanced. Yes, the EU has a surplus on goods exports to the US, but the US is winning strongly on services. And in the context of an overall annual relationship in trade of 1.6 trillion euro, the net surplus in favour of the EU is approximately 3%. So it's a broadly balanced relationship, and I think that context sometimes gets lost in the presentation, but it is one that is important in our consideration of what is an appropriate response by the EU. In relation to Hungary, I was there just last week. The concerns that we have in the Commission about rule of law related issues are well documented. I had direct engagement with a range of civil society organisations and media bodies during my visit there. And I am concerned at much of what I heard. I think there is a narrowing of the safe space for civil society organisations to operate within, and there's also a real challenge to having a free and independent pluralist media within the country, and that has a direct impact on the operation of the democratic institutions, holding people to account, and that's why the EU has had to regrettably use the tools at its disposal, and that has included withholding about €18 billion funding that should be made available to the people of Hungary, who strongly support EU membership. So I regret what you have referred to there in terms of the intended withdrawal from the ICC. We need countries to support the system of international justice, and the ICC is at the heart of that. I visited them in The Hague back in January. They're in a very challenging period at the moment, as you know, for different reasons, but unfortunately this is another retrograde step from the Hungarian authorities, and let's see what happens over the period ahead.
Taoiseach tá téarma cogadh trádála in úsáid inniu in annachchuid luachtáin an méontóil fáil leis an téirmíocht sin agus céir atá an rialtas chun dénas na seachtaí amach roiin chun donning lec leis na dúlan seo. And Commissioner, it was suggested by the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez this morning that an EU fund might be set up, financed by tariffs on US goods, to assist European companies affected by this situation. Do you think that's a runner at EU level?
Níl cogadh trádála siúl go fóil. Agus an rud is táchtaí ná go méid míad an cainteanna hosnú. Agus sin an aimimetáid an gimisiún, an aimimetá a going héin sa rialtas. Brehan big Commissioner Sefcovic ag búla ag sé caintle Lutnick Maden, agus an tlí is fear chun é seo réiteach ná cainteanna agus mar gan áras dá mar rud ag go méid cogadh trádála ag tosnú an méid demáiste a thuúca gas bheag go thuúfása ar fad agus tá míid go léir ag súil go méid réiteach ann in the cainteanna idir na Stáit Aontaithe agus an Gimisiún mar a dúirt Michael tá anna cuid trádála an fí láthair. Tá cuasaíocht na míocht agus an Gallagher sa Stáit Aontaithe láide go leor ag an méid seo. Agus mar an ggéine leis an Aontas Eorpach. Tá mar rud ag go mbeoch cogadh trádála feachse a bhd níos measa ní léon áras fao sin amóthú.
Yeah, our focus for now is on preventing the harm rather than responding to the harm, because we're still in a scenario where we're looking at potential. And while sentiment is immediate and uncertainty has immediate impacts, the direct impact of tariffs is something that will take some time to work its way through the system. And our focus is on the EU response, it's on negotiations, it's on preventing this from materialising in the first place. So I think it's premature to talk about an EU fund. When you talk about an EU fund, there aren't many potential sources of funding. Is it additional member state contributions? Is it new own resources? Is it collective borrowing? Is it reallocation of resources from one part of the budget to another? So we're not in that space, because our focus is on negotiations, but in parallel with that, finalising the set of EU countermeasures, so that in the event of negotiations failing, that we are in a position to respond comprehensively.
Taoiseach, if there are proposals on the table from the EU for retaliatory tariffs that disproportionately impact Ireland, how strongly are you willing to resist? Are you happy to go into those conversations, into those rooms and meetings, and say no, that it's a step too far, that those measures will hurt Ireland? Or there's a lot of talk about unity, so is it a case that we're going to have to swallow some very difficult pills?
Well, in the first instance, as we know, the Commission has exclusive jurisdiction in relation to trade matters, but to be fair to the President of the Commission, she has spoken to all of the heads of state. I know at the Trade Council, all the ministers of trade are engaging with the Commission and indeed with each other. So there has to be a collective response by definition. It's going to be extremely difficult to get the right balance. And that is why Europe is at the Commission, certainly from the President's statement over the last 48 or 24 hours, is very much looking towards a negotiation pathway. If you look at it even right now, those countries with a car industry, automotive industry, are really getting an exceptional hit. So there has to be solidarity across the board. Yes, we are inputting into this. We have made our views known to the Commission at official level, from myself to the President of the Commission, Taoiseach to Commissioner Sefcovic. Indeed, I've spoken to Commissioner McGrath as well, and he's well aware of the Irish position in respect to certain areas and certain sectors. So that's how it'll happen. No country is going to be shy, and Ireland will not be shy in saying, in terms of our interests, but also strategy. I mean, I think the strategy is the key issue here, in terms of designing countermeasures that would have the desired impact of bringing people to the table and enabling negotiations. The feedback so far from the US is, our sense, is that negotiations is the preferred route forward. So the next 48 hours will tell a lot, and I think what I detract from what I get from the President's speech is very much sort of wanting to engage and signalling a desire to engage, to negotiate a sensible settlement here.
We're listening here as early this morning, the